This is conversation number 2 in our Unbound Talks series during Black Philanthropy Month. If you missed conversation number 1, I am Renee Jocelyn, principal at Philanthropy Unbound. Thank you so much for joining us for these conversations. I am so excited that you are here and that we can build on last week's conversation on infrastructure. Before we begin, I really want to thank our advisors, Emma Gordon-Reed, Yvonne Moore, George Suttles, Marcus Littles, and Seitu Jamel Hart. You were all so instrumental in pulling this together, and I really appreciate you. Also want to thank my tribe who's pulled all this together, as well as the DJ who brought us in. So happy to have the music to kind of ease my nerves a little bit as we ease into this conversation. So this next session is on the competition for funding for Black Girls Initiatives and Black Boys Initiatives. Do we really have to compete? Now, I must admit, I was a little nervous bringing this conversation up because I wasn't sure how folks were going to take it. And the more I spoke to people about, should we talk about this? The more I got the thumbs up, yes, we should talk about it. So we're going to talk about this. It's about adding more money to the field, more money to the community, and not having to carve it up the way that we have been used to carving it up. And maybe they're right decisions or that can move us forward, and maybe we're doing the right thing. I don't know. That's why this is a conversation. So this panel will be moderated by Micah Vilmer, who is the partner at Frontline Solutions. Really excited to have Micah moderating this panel, as he's done research in both areas and knows a lot about this information. I also want to thank our Mindful Moment host, Yolo Akili, who is from BEAM. BEAM stands for Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, and they're going to be leading us, or he is going to be leading us through a moment just to center ourselves and get us ready for this conversation. Because again, I don't know where this is going to lead, but I am so excited. So first there's Yolo, and then the panel discussion. So be sure to put your questions in the chat because there will be a Q&A after, and I will see you there. Enjoy the conversation, and please, please, please make sure that you're entering some questions, suggestions, comments. We're really excited to talk about this.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon for folks. Welcome to the second session of Unbound Talks. Want to once again express my appreciation to Renee and Anthony and everyone for cultivating this space. I am excited today to share with us, like we did prior, a wellness moment, which is essentially a moment where I will share a tool and a practice for us that hopefully can help us as we continue to cultivate wellness throughout our political, social, emotional, spiritual lives. Today's tool is called the pause tool. And so I want to invite everyone to look into the chat because I believe Anthony's going to share in that chat the link to the exact tool that you can actually pull up. I'm going to give you all a moment to actually pull up that tool and want to go through that because it's a great tool for self-awareness, self-de-escalation, but also like critical tool for us in our wellness. All right. So I'll give you a moment. I'm going to just place that in the link. Check that out, open that up, and I'm going to take us through this tool and talk about why this is a really critical and powerful tool for us in cultivating wellness for our communities. Now, folks who have it open, you'll see that one of the biggest things about BEAM in our work is we understand making graphics and things that Instagram are really a way to communicate health and wellness concept. To get it up in the link in the chat box there, you'll see that it has the word pause, and it has for every letter, particular piece connected to that. What that's going to say is I'm going to take a piece, invite us, we can incorporate our own lives as we move through our conversation today, but as well as we move through our lives in general. All right. So pause for the P. When we're talking about self-de-escalation, we're talking about recognizing that we're in a moment where we're going to be activated by many different things. And I intentionally use the word activating instead of triggering because triggering can be a very aggressive word. We are activated and things are awakened within us by the nature of what's happening in this political moment, right? And sometimes when those feelings come up, it may lead us to enact behaviors that we are not necessarily proud of or are not represented our values or in dignity with our values, right? And so the first thing we need to do is to cultivate an ongoing awareness of paying attention to our body's thoughts and feelings. Like asking the question, what happens to your body when you get elevated or angry, right? So for example, I know when I get anxious, I know I experience tension on my side. What happens in your body? I believe that our bodies are always sending us messages about what's going on within and around us, but sometimes we're checked out, we've been disembodied, or we're disconnecting and we're currently in our head and detached. I want to encourage us to cultivate a practice to kind of say, what happens to my body when I get angry, when I feel loved, when I feel a variety of different things? What signals does my body send to me to let me know it's time to pay attention, to check in? Do you clench your fist? Do you feel your elevated heart rate? All of these different things are messages that we may need to pause, right? Are you breathing? A big consequence of what happens when we're really elevated or when we're escalated is that our breath becomes really short. And as a yoga teacher, one of the most powerful practices we can do is take that deep breath to kind of help center ourselves and bring us back to a state of equilibrium, right? We also need to be mindful of the story we're telling ourselves. That's a really big piece. We talked a little bit about last week about the feelings and the feelings wheel and about how we have the feeling and the story, right? How those are two different things. When we're in this moment where we may be escalated things, we need to think about what story am I telling myself and how is the story I'm telling myself escalating myself, de-escalating myself? How is it minimizing the situation or maximizing it? Or how is it helping me see things, right? So when we think about this moment where all these things are constantly circling us, we start off with the P by paying attention to our body, our thoughts, and our feelings, the stories we're telling ourselves, what our body is saying that we need, what's going on within our body, so when we get activated, and also paying attention to thoughts and thought streams that we have, the patterns that exist there, right? That's our P. Our A is assess what is activating me. Going back to that language of activating, right? I really want to encourage us to think about activating as opposed to triggered, right? What feelings are being activated? You might walk into a room with me and you might say something that activates or awakens a feeling within me, but I have a choice about how I will engage in my behavior based off of the feeling that is awakened or activated within me, right? That's about centeredness, not self-control, because I'm not necessarily interested in control. I'm interested in centeredness. And when I'm self-centered, I'm able to operate from a place of dignity. I'm able to operate from a place of honor of myself, right? When we assess what's activating us, oftentimes, and I would say 90% of the work that we do in mediation and mental health support, we find that most people who are angry or upset often don't feel heard. That people often feel like they need to make themselves bigger, to yell, to scream, to throw things because they don't feel heard or seen, sometimes stemming from a deeper childhood trauma or hurt, right? It can be sometimes not feeling heard and I'm feeling misunderstood. Like you're not hearing me, you're not seeing me. And so maybe the responses that you get from me that may seem elevated are actually coming from this place of, I'm not feeling understood. So assessing what is coming up and maybe checking in with yourself being like, hold on, do I feel heard? Is that what's happening? Do I not feel understood? Am I upset about what is being said or something else that happened to me recently, right? So this is about the importance of cultivating ongoing self-awareness, is being able to check in and what's going on with me? Am I coming home and I'm bringing what happened to me at work into this space and now I'm more elevated about something that normally would not bother me? What is that particular piece? So we need to assess what's activating us, right? Pause, pay attention to our body's thoughts and feelings, assess what is activating us. The U, understand the roots of our feelings. An important thing about anger is that anger is what I call an umbrella emotion, right? So the anger it's a valid, powerful, and necessary emotion, but underneath that umbrella, we often find the hurt, the sadness that many of us are not encouraged to go to, that it's not safe for many of us to go to. We know many Black men and masculine folks are encouraged to stay on top of the umbrella, to have a limited emotional range. We know that for many Black women, and when Black women go into the space of naming hurt and naming those pain, that sometimes it's not honored or listened to or valued, right? And so we also have to think about how we do healing justice work and then dismantle oppression so that people can actually have safe spaces to express themselves and be connected. So what values of mine are being challenged under the U? Understanding your feelings. Are you seeking to resolve a disagreement? Are you trying to maintain power and control? Now, I'm going to talk about y'all because I know we all in the same boat, right? Sometimes we think that we're actually trying to resolve an agreement when we're trying to when what we're doing actually is asserting dominance through this kind of patriarchal, a white supremacist model, which is not actually helping us reach resolution. One of the most important frameworks of this is thinking It's not me and you versus each other. It's me and you versus the problem. The problem might be our communication. The problem might be a disagreement, but it's not us versus each other. It's us versus the problem. And if we collaborate for that, we can, by getting to understand, we can understand the roots of our feelings, but we also can shift the dynamic of the energy from when we're in conflict, right? S is set boundaries, separate, ensure safety. One of the most powerful things we can do when we're elevated is say to someone, I'm not in the space to have this conversation right now. It's an important conversation. I want to come back to this at a later time. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Because I want to show up in a way that is in my values, that is in your dignity and my dignity. And I'm not in the place where I can do that. I don't have the capacity right now. So I'm going to step aside. You're asserting your boundaries. You're letting them know that you are centering the respect of all involved, and you step away and you come back when you feel less frustrated. But it's important when we think about gender and race and all these pieces that we try to create safety together by honoring where we're at and how it shows up in our bodies, right? Last one is E, empathizing with those involved. Everyone deserves respect. How could the other person be experiencing me? Stepping outside of ourselves, right? Like, what does it mean? How is this person might be experiencing me? How would my actions impact other folk? You know, as someone who has done work around gender-based violence, I recognize that moving the space with women as a person projected as a man in a body, as a body that's read as male, when I come into that space, it activates and triggers folks. And so I need to be really mindful of how I'm showing up in space, understanding that it's not about my intention, it's about the impact and the cultural and historical impact that also precedes my presence, right? And then thinking about what others are trying to express, how can we work for understanding? That's a critical ending for the question. How can you work for understanding? What helps us get there? Me and you versus the problem, not me and you versus each other. This is how we create community. This is how we honor the dignity and respect of all folks. This is one simple tool we use. We have lots of tools, once again, on our website, beam.community. I want to encourage you to incorporate this, share this with your friends and your colleagues, share it with folks, send it in a text message. I love to hear so many people have dialogue. And I want to invite us to center this too when we're having a conversation today, because things may come up for us, right? We might be activated. And so that is the wellness moment that I have for today. I want to thank everyone again for taking the time to allow me to cultivate this space. I want to encourage all of you to center yourselves, to respect and honor your own, sit in your values and your dignity, and understand that it's us versus the problem, not never us versus each other, right? And that's an important piece to hold. Thank y'all so much.
cannot way us off. Amazing to Yolo, incredible wellness moment started and to connect us to what it takes to have these sorts of conversations. I cannot think of a better way for us to embrace it. The thing that one of the things that I'm most excited about this moment is just the opportunity to be our full selves in a way that we never have been before, right? To go from twerking and working on for the DJ to embracing who we are and embracing ourselves and our ways to process our emotions and gaining some emotional intelligence to having this conversation that we're about to have now. So I couldn't be more excited to be jumping into this and could not be more excited to be jumping into it with the folks that we have around this table, some of whom I know, others that I've admired from afar. And so we're going to get folks introduced really quick, and we're going to dive right into the conversation. So I will just ask folks very briefly just to introduce themselves, give us a little bit of context to their work and the experiences that they're bringing to this conversation. And then we will dive into some of the conversation. So I'll go first. I'm Micah Gilmer. I'm one of the co-founders and a partner at Frontline Solutions. And most of my work is supporting our teams that do work around strategic planning, evaluation, and organizational transformation for nonprofit organizations and for foundations as well. And so have had the chance to work with Renee and many of the folks on this panel over the years and really excited to jump into it. And I'm pleased to introduce Shonda Chapman, who's the director of the Girls Fund Initiative at the Ms. Foundation for Women. Shonda, do you mind just telling us a little bit about your work?
Certainly. I have to get my mind back right, though. We had that DJ, and I have to pull it back together and act right. So I'm back. So Shonda Chapman, I'm the director of the Girls Fund Initiative at the Ms. Foundation for Women. A lot of times I like to start these conversations before I tell you more about my work and what I do. I want to tell you a little bit about my positionality and sort of what I'm bringing to the table because our positionality absolutely matters. So I identify as a fat, queer, arguably light-skinned Black woman from a Southern working class family background. I have two young children, a boy and a girl, who really ought to be commended for raising their unruly and incorrigible parent. I've been directly impacted by many systems, both as a youth and adult. I've been pushed into systems that criminalize women and families. I have the experience of incarceration. I also have a background in research, policy, and advocacy. Prior to joining Ms., I worked on a federally funded national initiative aimed at preventing and ending girls' incarceration at the Beery Institute. And I've also served as a co-director for the Beyond the Bars Fellowship program at the Center for Justice at Columbia University. So my work really has partially, based on my own experiences, been focused on racial justice, gender justice, and really understanding the ways girls of color get pushed into system involvement. So all those things really led me to this work. They inform my orientation to my work in philanthropy. My connection to these issues are lived. They're not theoretical or intellectual. And they anchor and shape my vision and my ability to pose the questions that we want to think about, and really embolden me to think about pushing the envelope in philanthropy. As you may know, Ms. Foundation is a public feminist foundation. We're one of the first and largest women's funds. And the Girls Fund Initiative is being developed to really expand our grant making and our capacity building resources to support the leadership and the development of girls of color in the U.S.
Thank you so much. I love that arguably light-skinned. I have the same. Some people say I don't necessarily agree. But I thought we transitioned from you to someone who was inarguably light-skinned, Michael Smith, who's the executive director of My Brother's Keeper at the Obama Foundation.
Shady. I get to be, my fist emoji is very dark brown. I just want to say. Michael Smith, executive director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. It's good to be here with such incredible family, colleagues. I've been doing this work of My Brother's Keeper for about 7 years now. I led the work of My Brother's Keeper in the Obama White House, was a part of the team that helped create it starting in the summer of 2013 after the verdict in the Trayvon Martin trial, and then led it through those years at the White House and now at the Obama Foundation. Today, the work of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance is all about building safe and supportive communities where boys and young men of color feel valued and have clear pathways to opportunity. In the Obama White House, we were about a policy initiative, and we were trying to change federal policy to make a difference and stand in the gap for boys and young men of color. Now we are really much about getting behind communities that are doing this work on the front line and providing them with the support that they need through technical assistance, through financial investments, and continuing to build this national call to action to make sure that our boys and young men of color don't fall to the cracks. About me, Shonda, I feel like I could have just repeated almost everything you said. I'm not sure if I don't want to call myself fat yet. I got to come to terms with that. But you know, gay Black man, been doing this work. It's personal to me. Grew up in a single parent household. You know, for all of the reasons that they say we can't succeed. I was able to succeed because a lot of people built bridges for me and helped me to navigate those landmines that the society set up for me systemically. And so I do this work to make sure that we're building a country and a community where our young men of color can just be. They don't have to be extraordinary. They don't have to be, you know, unordinary. They can just be. They can live lives of greatness. They can live lives of joy. They can live lives of peace. Without having to constantly dodge the landmines that this country has set up for them.
Awesome, thank you. Shai Singletary is the Chief Reparations Officer and co-founder at the Cypress Fund. She also serves as Movement Partnerships Manager at the Solidaire Network. Welcome, Shai. I think we can't hear you, or I can at least. Let's come. Yeah, still not hearing you. I'm sorry. Let's come back to you in just a second. So we'll come back to Shai. Instead, we'll go first to Greg Hodge, who's the Interim Executive Director at the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Mike, how you doing? Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be on this call with these amazing leaders, amazing servant leaders of our community. I'm here in Oakland, California, where I serve as the Chief Network Officer for the Brotherhood of Elders Network, an intergenerational network of Black men that are advocating on behalf of our kids, our community, and I mean our entire for the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, a role which in this new iteration of the Executive Alliance is about amplifying the voice of field leaders and philanthropy to sustain the field, because we know that our work is still fragile, just like the girls' work is still fragile in terms of where we are and how to make that work sustainable. We still have a lot to do, and to develop new leaders in the field, to support people like Jamal Jones and others who at the National Youth Alliance represent 350 organizations who are doing work around the country. I get to be in partnership with people like Michael Smith and Sean Dove and Michael Gilmer and a bunch of my sister friends and my queer folks here in the Bay Area. We are working right now on something called the African American Response Circle. This is an African American response to the COVID virus in our community. What can we be doing to keep ourselves safe? What can we be doing to deal with the long-standing disparities that we see in health and in education and in jobs and housing and a range of things? And I think the through line for me through the work, and I guess I'm sort of like the senior Baba, the senior elder, the senior statesman. I appreciated the photograph that got used for the promo materials. I haven't looked like that in 20 years. So y'all might be the light skinned was. I'm the hairless was. I'm the one who's like, you know, got to earn the gray hair, and it's just really happy to be a part of this. I'm a Baba in the community here in Oakland. I'm a dad. I'm a culture keeper as a West African musician and teacher. And I think about my own children. When we think about what we work for, I have 5 beautiful children, 4 of whom are adults, 2 of whom are making a living as artists, and then an 11-year-old who thinks she's grown. So my job is to actually treat other people's children the way I treat my children, to show them love, to show them care, to make sure that they can be everything that the Creator has intended for them to be. And so as we do this work, we acknowledge that we're on Ohlone land here in Northern California. We acknowledge that our ancestors laid a path for us to be able to do this work. And I'm gonna be the first one to put a shout out to African-American, Asian-American woman on a major ticket, Kamala Harris, who is in the footsteps of Shirley Chisholm and Ella Baker and Septima Clark and Queen Hatshepsut and all these other powerful, fierce Black women throughout history, as well as in our contemporary community.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg, for that warm introduction. I'm Shai, were we able to get it fixed?
I'm hoping so. Can you hear me now? Awesome. Thank you for such a great introduction. Hi, everyone. I am Cheyenne Singletary. I am a connector and a reparations officer. So the main body of my work is really thinking about how do we do deep reparations work, both with folks who we're in community with and folks who we want to expand our community to. I'm proud to be the the Movement Partnerships Manager over at Solidaire, where I get to help movement folks have access to both financial resources, capital, really whatever it is that they need to see our movements build very strongly. And then on the other side of my life, I'm a co-founder and the Chief Reparations Officer at Cypress, which is a social justice fund based in the Carolinas that's really thinking about how do we build powerful movements in North and South Carolina. As a Black girl who grew up in South Carolina, who went off to Spelman and got to travel the world, I saw what it looked like for rural communities to be left behind, for Black folks who look like my grandparents, who worked hard every day, to be spit up and shoot out when a factory decided to leave them alone. How queer Black girls like myself didn't see themselves anywhere until they left from home. And the story of Cypress is really a story of how I got to come home, how donors got to come home, and how people who live there get to build a community that is inclusive of all of us, how movements within the Carolinas are able to really speak for themselves, and how we change the way that folks think about the South overall, and what it means to be a Southern-rooted person who's doing Southern reparations-based work.
Awesome. So glad to have you as a part of the panel. And as a North Carolinian, or at least a North Carolina resident, excited to have you with us as well. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Monique Morris, who is Executive Director of Grant Makers for Girls of Color.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Monique Morris here. Grant Makers for Girls of Color is now a new independent entity, continuing to hold space for girls of color, both inside of philanthropy in terms of shaping conversations that hold space to increase investments that support girls of color, but also moving into thought leadership externally. I'm the founder of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, still sit as the board chair and the author of several books that have explored conditions that impact Black communities. I think most people are familiar with my work around Black girls, Push Out, and Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues. But I'm also the author of Too Beautiful for Words, which centers a young man, and also Black Stats, and some work that I did with Kemba Smith to write her book, Poster Child. So I take my writing seriously and kind of move into space around narrative and storytelling in a way that I hope brings us into community using multiple voices and realities as we explore some of these real critical issues in our community through different genres as well. I'm an advocate, stand survivors of sexual violence. I am a survivor of sexual violence, and lead as much as possible with the idea that we can heal from these historical traumas and personal traumas, and try to infuse my language, work, and practice with these ideas. I'm a mother of two beautiful girls. Greg was actually the facilitator of my youngest daughter's naming ceremony. So it's all family here. And and I am excited to be in conversation with you all.
Awesome. So this really is going to be a conversation, and I am excited to be someone who's charged with sort of moderating and holding space for this, but really going to let folks talk to each other and really get into it. And so I will throw out the first question to get us started, and then folks will feel free to jump in after that. And of course, I'll jump in as to sort of help manage time and move things forward. Shonda, I'm actually going to start with you, and I'm going to ask this question. Not everyone will get a chance to answer it, but we'd love to get a couple different responses from folks. Shonda, as you think about your work, and if you think about your life and who you show up with and the identities that you carry, what's the future that you imagine that you're working towards?
Okay, we don't have time for all of it, but I'll give you a brief version. I am envisioning a world where, quite simply, the power and the possibilities of girls are not limited by their race, their gender, their identity, their sexual orientation, disabilities, or any other axes of identity. We know, of course, that Black girls are the experts of their own experiences and that they have an appetite to lead and create change. And we know with the right opportunities, they have the ability, the ideas, a passion to write their own stories, to create their own futures, and to drive change in their communities in the world. But we also know that they face really tremendous structural barriers to being able to do that. We also believe, I also believe that girls have the right to be safe. They have the right to be self-determinant. They have the right to have their gender and their sexuality respected and free from limiting concepts of masculinity and femininity. And the last thing I'll say here, because I want to make sure we all get a chance to jump in, is that we believe that girls absolutely, like Michael said, have the access to joy, have the right to the access to joy. And I want these things for all Black people. I want them for Black boys, for Black girls, and everybody that doesn't exist on that gender spectrum. But especially for Black girls who really do have to suffer in silence or be penalized for their resilience and for their resistance.
Somebody else want to jump in next?
I'll hop in next. Ooh, no,
please, Shy.
but you got
Shy,
it.
please. No.
I think for me, what I'm really dreaming about is a world where equity is the middle point, but liberation is actually what we're all aiming towards. It's a world where we're talking about reparations in this lifetime, transformation in the next, and healing for the following generation and everyone that's happened in between. For me, the word
I'm gonna stop you right there. Can you go back and do that again? So
yeah.
Reparations.
You want me to start reparations right here?
Yeah.
I'm talking about reparations today. I think sometimes we make it seem like reparations has to be this difficult thing that maybe in 7th generations we can talk about. But the reality is that reparations happens right now, every single day. And it happens both in the ways that we hold people accountable for the ways that they've done harm to us, how we hold folks in community for how we can heal together, and how we build and dream of a future where that harm doesn't happen again. Right. And I think, for me, that's really what the work is about. That's the only reason I'm in philanthropy. I'm here to get the coins, bring the coins home, but then to also talk about, like, how do we build with these folks? How do we shift this around? And how don't we spend all of our time thinking about destroying these systems, but actually creating transformative spaces where Black folks, queer folks, Indigenous folks really get to dream of an entirely different world that has never existed before. So we're building in our, generations moving forward that they look back at this time and remember that we were the ones, as well as our ancestors who helped push us to this point. So I'm talking about reparations today, tomorrow, until we get everything we deserve.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. I'll add to that, Mike, and I'm glad Shy went before you. Actually, the word liberation was central to what I was going to add to this conversation. And the only thing I would add to what Ms. Chapman and Shy has said is this idea that we ought to value our culture enough, the best parts of our culture, the healthy parts of our culture, and then innovate on that. Not see it as static, not see it as something that's stuck in some romanticized period when Black folks were kings and queens. I think we need to get out of that paradigm. I think that we need to be human beings. We need to be men and women, however we define men and women, masculinity and femininity, in the context of how we think about this from our culture perspective. I want to see a world where the kids on my block in West Oakland can play outside again, where boys and girls can be children until they're ready to be adults and not be forced into some premature adulthood by having to take on, are you my little man, or you my little woman responsibilities. I want to see young people be nurtured to be caring, confident, competent Africans. And I say Africans specifically beyond being Black, because I think we're part of a global family and Africa is waiting to be created, as Bob Marley would say. I don't mean it in the ethnic terms of whether you're Yoruba or Xhosa, or you grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, or Pine Bluff, Arkansas, like I did, but rather that we see ourselves as part of a world family, participating in a global economy that has equity and fairness and justice as the signature values.
Mm-hmm. I would just add that I think it's really critical that we also, and what I want to see is a deeper engagement of freedom beyond the rhetorical. I think for so much of our collective existence, our ancestors' imagination was wrapped around the notion of freedom without a practice of it. And so for me, in the future, building upon all the things that have already been said, it's really about exercising power to manifest a freedom that exists emotionally, spiritually, physically, intellectually, in relationships with each other and with ourselves, to provide the maximum opportunity for this type of healing.
I love the way that y'all are talking about that world, because the sense is that we're not just looking for parity with white folks, right? That's not actually what reparations is about. That's actually not what freedom and what liberation is about, because I would argue that white folks, many of them are not free, right? And so we're developing a new model. We're creating our Africa, as you said, Greg. Can you talk about, Greg already brought up some of the challenges that our boys and girls and folks that don't identify as boys or girls face in terms of being forced into adulthood too early, experiencing trauma and violence. What do you wish folks knew about the unique experience that it is to be a Black girl or a Black boy or a Black gender non-conforming young person?
You know, one of the things I would jump in on this, kind of building from the last question, is I think about this idea of RAM versus ROM, like for those of you that are into computers. And imagine growing up Black, whether you're a Black boy or a Black girl. I think about myself, I think about my little brothers, how much time you're having to spend. Can I wear this hairstyle? Do I have to speak this way? Can I cross this street? Can I go 2 miles over the speed limit? Am I wearing the right clothes? Am I taking the right course? Am I doing the right thing for my community? Am I doing the right thing for all Black people? Imagine how much time we have to sit in and hold these things because of the racist systems in which we have to operate. From the time we are the littlest kids to the time we are in the corporate world, no matter how successful you get. Imagine how much RAM and ROM we have to take up navigating this racist society. And we still become great. We still break through chains. We still create extraordinary things. We still push this country to where it thought it could never be and make pathways for everybody. Imagine the greatness, imagine the brilliance, imagine the joy if we could get rid of all of that we have to spend making sure that we can navigate these traps of this country. That is the greatness that I see in our young people. And that is the greatness that they are continuing to operate in, despite the fact that we've created a society for them that victimizes, marginalizes, brutalizes them from the time that they are born in this country.
I'll jump in quickly. I think one of the things first, let me just tell you how I'm so exhausted. I'm tired of having to explain why focus on girls. Like, if somebody asked me that question another time, we might have to go outside and handle it, because I just won't continue to be asked these crazy things. So I'm not going to do that. But I will say that just because you figured out how to not die doesn't mean you don't need care. So I came into my office today and hadn't been here for months, just because I was thinking I'd have better tech here in the office. And I have an orchid here that somehow has managed to not die since March. And it is, not only is it not dead, you probably can't see it in the background there, it's blooming, has lots of flowers on it. And I came in and I just picked her up and I was like, yes, girl, you did it. You did it. They tried to kill you and you did it. You survived the Rona and no resources, and you did that, girl. But that doesn't mean she doesn't need water. She doesn't need light. She doesn't need all the things that everybody needs to survive. And the same thing I say for Black children, especially Black girls, who really do get invisibilized in these discourses on who's worse off. And so they kind of either have to be quiet, or if they say something, they're angry. Why are they taking up too much space? And so I say, girl, you deserve water and you deserve light. The second thing I just like to do a little bit is to trouble our question a little bit. And Micah, like you and Dr. Morris, my background is in research. And so one of the things we know is that if you start off with a bad question, everything else can we curse? Oh, I won't curse. Everything else is messed up after that. And, your question is flawed, your approach is going to be flawed, and so is your solution. And so I just want to take a second and trouble our question a little bit, because it sets us up in a binary that sort of just reifies the gender binary, and it really invisibilizes the expansiveness of gender. forces us to choose in between one or two kind of configuration when we know that that spectrum is more like 1 to 1,000. And this lack of attention has deadly consequences for trans, queer, and gender nonconforming youth. It also reinforces a hierarchy of oppression that really is rooted in white supremacy and colonialism and patriarchy. And that is ultimately in service of capitalism. And this is a gender construct that we as Black people didn't make. It forces us to sort of genderize solutions it forces us to genderize questions and ultimately solutions that might not always be gendered. And then lastly, I'll just say that one of the deep fundamental issues with this sort of competitive girls versus boys setup is that it really does remove boys and girls from a relationship with each other. And it assumes that they don't intersect, when of course they do, in our homes, in our schools, and everywhere else. Anybody that has done programming with girls knows that you can't program with a girl if she's not bringing her homegirls or cousins and, her play sister. Everybody's coming. She's caring for everybody in the community. So privileging one or the other actually does reproduce, I think, the oppressions of patriarchy, and it forces us to decide who's more important. And as people who exist in philanthropy, we know that we have the privilege and the ability to not just aim for solutions, but we set the question. So it's just really important for me, and I wanted to make sure that we talked about that when we talked about our boys versus girls framework.
Yeah, totally. And I think, spoiler alert for the folks listening to the panel, we don't want to be in competition. We want to be in deep relationship and in partnership with each other. And I think everyone on the panel is aligned with that. I wanted to spend a little more time digging into that dynamic that you really helpfully brought up, Shonda, in terms of the ways that we are sometimes ourselves through our own internalized patriarchy and our own internalized racism, but also externally, we are kind of forced into that competitive framework or that sort of binary approach to the things. Can folks just talk a little bit about how does that show up? What are the experiences that you've had? What are the things that you've seen? What are the frameworks that are out there that are really kind of leading to that sort of division in terms of competing for resources?
Well, I was going to offer something in the context of double dutch, because honestly, I just wish the world could see eyes through someone who jumps double dutch at all times, and we could construct systems that are responsive to the rules of double dutch. We're used to one rope when we talk about jumping rope, and people think about one rope as the way you quote unquote jump rope. But we know that young people, mostly Black girls, created a space out on schoolyards and in communities where there were two ropes, multiple ropes, and you had to navigate that rope. You had to navigate the system. You had to have somebody who knew how to turn. You had to have somebody who can keep rhythm. And that rhythm is what sets a standard for how these young people who are trying to make it in the cracks and in the system find a stability in order to move forward. In my work, we've often been told if you don't have two ropes, that we don't have two ropes, right? We can't jump rope if we only have one rope. We only have enough for one person to play. There's not enough room for everybody. All these kinds of things. Some things that have been, I think highly offensive said to me when I was first entering the space, asking for there to be resources allocated also toward girls and young women, where people would just say, it's important work, Monique, I know in my community, but you're not our priority, or this is not our priority. And so to be told you're not a priority is the same as being told, you can't jump rope with us, right? We're going to jump our rope our way. And rather than create a space for there to be cables that function as rope or a way to navigate a complex system and find a stability in that complexity to create something very beautiful and magical and rhythmic in a way that can speak to our souls and provide a significant source of healing. So, I think our structures, if we were to think about who needs to be in place to create some of these conditions for all of us to play, for all of us to be in community with each other, for there to be those who turn the rope, for those who keep count, those who chant along, those who actually jump, then we recognize that there's enough room for all of us, rather than seeing that this as a pie that has to be divvied and that we have to sort of be in competition with each other for. I do recall early on, and I'm going to further complicate the question, by offering a truth that might, be hard for some of us to hear. Is early on in conversations that were centering only the boys and young men, I offered that it wouldn't be successful. And I offered that it wouldn't be successful because we were constructing something that was being created to the exclusion of the girls and the young women. And it was hard to sit in civil rights spaces. It was very hard to sit in philanthropic spaces. It was hard to be a sister of a young man who was locked up and who I was watching be in severe pain and know that I needed to be there for him and recognize that my pain was going to be invisible to our movements and recognize that my sisters who were locked up were not going to be deemed as important. Right. And so, you know, the way that we've constructed a narrative around who is of value and who is important is very much aligned with the single rope rather than the double rope. And so for me, it's been really important to reconcile some of those early moments and early conversations and a need for us to heal. I'm actually happy that this conversation is happening because we have to acknowledge the things that were said to each other you know, in those early days that set the foundation for much of what we have today, and recognize that I've always been about trying to figure out how we can bridge, right? How we can not have to advocate, as Shonda was saying, for the value of girls and women being in this space, but a deep recognition that without women and girls in this space, all the other elements of our successful cultivation of community will fail. Because we are sharing systems, sharing homes, sharing communities, sharing all the things that create, you know, our families. We're in it in that very real way.
Thank you so much.
If I could add a little bit to that, Dan, and I'm really glad that both Shonda and Monique, you challenge us around the question, because as a former trial attorney, the question does matter. Get the question right, you're more likely to get the answer that, you know, that is going to be meaningful. I think that two things about this. I think that the unfortunate truth is that, Monique, you're right. And I think that in many ways, what we often have failed to do is to notice how this happens in the context of white supremacy. That our whole construct as Europeanized Black folks, it has to be either this or it's that. So as I, you know, got involved in this work in, say, in the late 90s, like this iteration of the work, and as the 2025 campaign for Black Men and Boys came together, when MBK was announced from the White House, people were saying to us, well, you know, somehow this is just about the boys. For a lot of us, it was never just about the boys. It was about our community. But the misread from some people who were on the outside of our community is that they began immediately, I love the metaphor of the rope, of the jump rope, of the double dutch. Because and this is why I love hanging around my folks like Monique, because even as you're describing it, you went into the rhythm that's required to get into the game, right? A lot of people didn't take the time to lean into the rhythm of what was going on and jumped in with a critique before there was a conversation. And so I'm like you, Monique, even if it's 15 years later, whatever it is, that we're now starting to have this conversation about community. Because I think that if we had named this panel not Black boys versus Black girls, you know, why should we compete, whatever, we should be saying white supremacy versus African descent people. Because then we could actually have a conversation about village making, about rehumanizing ourselves, around even understanding the role of how we socialize our children across that 1 to 1,000 continuum that Shonda talked about in terms of how we identify, how we build identity, how we claim who we are. So I just think that this is the moment that we ought to be able to put that to a side, interrogate it, figure out what we learned from it, the apologies that need to be made, the forgiveness that need to be sought, because the moment we're in a pandemic, in this moment of great potential, we got to get this right. We cannot have it be this binary of what we've been doing. And funders need to understand some basic things. Give us general support for multiple years. Endow the work. Don't have us chasing dollars year in and year out. I love Shai's, you got the best job title. You got the best job title on the panel. Chief Reparations Officer. Like this is and I have to say that Shy is your generation of leadership has to really draw in the lessons from a previous generation and then run with it. Like not walk with it, but run with it. I'm not gonna put all the pressure on our younger leaders, but we need y'all to be we need you to be the leaders that you already are.
I wanted to go ahead, jump in.
I was just going to say, when people ask me that question, I always go back and say, can you give more? At Solidaire, one of the things that we talk about all the time, right, is can you give more? Can you seed a little bit more? Don't make me have to choose. We don't have to choose. At last count, there's like 630 billionaires in the US alone. That's 630 people who have more money than they will ever be able to spend times 5, like times 50, right? Times their children, times multiple generations. Over here, the question isn't, can we support Black girls? Can we support Black boys? Can we support, whatever, right? It's how deep do we want to support them? How much more can we give them? How much easier can we make this? Can you put your body on the line for this? Can you use the political weight of your work on this? Can you divest from the places that gave you wealth so that our communities don't have to continue in this struggle? We don't talk about when people bring that question to me, why Black liberation? Why not? Why Black girls? Because I stand. Why Black boys? Because they deserve. Like, that is the question, right? It's not, and I think that's the point as a funder. That's where we're at. How do we push people to open up their endowments, to give more than 10% of their endowment? How do we start spin downs? How do we do all of these things so that the questions that we're asking are not divisive, but that they're additive, that they're reflective of the fact that funding needs to flow into communities in a way that wraps around the community, right? That hits multiple entry points, that addresses multiple issues that are general operating, that are multi-year, that aren't fighting, and that at the core of this, we're really talking about how does our collective liberation happen when we all dig a little bit deeper, when we all think a little bit more broadly, and we remove the question of the binary, whether that be from our funding, from our conversations about gender, or even from the places that we think of ourselves within this community.
Yeah, Micah. Sorry, go ahead.
Jump in. Well, I was going to ask Mike, and this may be in line with some of what you were thinking. Monique, you talked about sort of some of that history in terms of our very recent history, in terms of the way that the Boys and Men of Color movement kind of came to the fore, and some of the conversations that were had, and this sort of maybe deficit thinking around it's our turn or it's our time or we can't lose focus or whatever. And I wanted to maybe dig a little bit more into that, and just I know I was around for some of that. Michael and Greg were around for some of that as well. And just to talk and maybe acknowledge some of maybe things that we would do differently if we could go back again.
Yeah, I'll get into that. If I could just say on the previous conversation, I think what philanthropy and capitalism and social innovation, all systems that I have been a part of, what they do in America, it's not just about boys and girls, it's about solutions in general. It's as if all of those systems, white supremacy, systemic racism, burn down the house. And what philanthropy comes in and does and say, I want to give you doors. I want to give you windows. We really like windows. I'm going to give you 30 windows. Aren't I great? Let's have a gala and applaud myself for giving you 30 windows instead of rebuilding the foundation, instead of rebuilding the house from the ground up. It takes it all connected together in order to properly shelter people. And I think, that's what happens. And so you end up with philanthropy leading to people falling in love with the solutions and not the problems. So I want to fund criminal justice reform. I want to fund Europe. I want to fund youth build. Not I want to step back and look at the holistic problem and why our kids are getting there in the first place. The other thing that philanthropy does is it creates this ridiculous Hunger Games where organizations and initiatives are having to constantly compete against each other because, as Dr. Morris was saying, we imagine this world where the pie is so small. And so that's not only happening between Black boys and Black girls, that's what's happening in the entire field of social justice and trying to rebuild, reshape, disrupt, dissolve these horrible systems that have our communities and our families in the situation they're in the first place. Micah, on your other question, it's really interesting. I was a part of the team that helped design My Brother's Keeper. If you go back to 2013, there was not only the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin, then there was the verdict in this case. And President Obama gave us a prize press briefing where, he said, Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. Trayvon could have been my son. And he said, there has to be more we could do to make sure young men of color know that their country cares about them and is willing to invest in them. And at that time, I was running the Social Innovation Fund, political appointee in the administration. I was tears in my eyes. I have a president who speaks for me, who sees me. That's amazing. At that time, anywhere I went in the field, I would hear from folks all the time, why doesn't President Obama care about Black boys? He has the White House Council on Women of Girls. He's doing this for women. He doesn't seem to care about boys. Why does he care about boys? And so when we started to create My Brother's Keeper, I was like, we're finally responding. We forgot about the unique issues of the boys. Never once in any of our minds circled were we not thinking about, the inextricable issues, that we weren't thinking about intersectionality. Never for one moment. We sat in rooms in the White House and planned who would be against this, how will our response would be. We never for a minute thought that we could have gotten this wrong. And when we designed My Brother's Keeper in the Obama administration, not only because we believed in intersectionality and you had a gay Black man that was running My Brother's Keeper, but because we had a very risk-averse legal shop, we couldn't spend a dime of money that was specifically about race and gender. So we created a platform that says we want to talk about some of the unique issues that boys and young men of color face, but we want to create solutions that build off of what, Angela Glover Blackwell talks about, those curb cuts. And so we're going to look at second chance Pell, making sure that all incarcerated individuals have access to Pell Grants. We want to create success mentor initiatives to make sure that all 6th and 9th graders in the country have access to mentors that help with chronic absenteeism. We want to create new partnerships between the Department of Education and the Department of Justice so that all of our young people, when they're re-entering from this horrible system, have an opportunity to succeed. And so that's how we looked at it. But if I take a step back now, I definitely realize that we created this big moment that allowed folks to potentially maybe further pit folks against each other. I do think if you take a deeper look, if you shovel a little further, you actually do see that a lot of the investment, all of the investment that happened from a federal level, but most of the investment that happened from a philanthropic level, even though it was talking about boys and young men of color, did indeed create those curb cut moments that was leading to better solutions for boys and girls.
So it's helpful to recognize that we have to move into a space, and I think that that's partly what fueled the creation of G4GC, is that if we don't name it, then the sort of happenstance trickle down of resources to girls of color, Black girls, isn't helpful. That to map the margins and to truly practice a structure of intersectionality in philanthropy, we have to name it. We have to say that you are important and you are worthy of investment, not just if you happen to be in the program that was designed for boys, or you happen to be in the area where there is a program that's designed for boys, or that you happen to be in an area that's designed, where there's a program designed for girls. That part of our challenge in creating new structures, and I think reimagining what's possible here, is to design something that's intentionally intersectional beyond just the statement of our identities, but the creation of new platforms and systems that provide a maximum opportunity for us to reach young people at the intersections of their identities and the complexity of their issues that we're seeking to, particularly as they cause harm and perpetuate oppression in their lives. Kim Crenshaw and I had a conversation about this practice of intersectionality through G4GC a few weeks ago, where we talked about what it looks like for philanthropy to actually practice intersectionality. And a lot of that comes from participatory models that we know are rooted in some of our indigenous practices that we just haven't engaged. And that, I think many of us, now that we're in these positions, are trying to think through how we build out structures and programs and practices that can, move beyond, what Greg has called our Europeanized Blackness, but to really think about some of the indigenous wisdom of our own ancestors that can guide us in the creation of something different, something new, so that we're not saying, here's a program for girls, and yeah, boys, if you happen to be here, great. Or here's a program for boys, and okay, gender expansive youth, if you are in the neighborhood, you can stop by too, right? But to make sure that people see themselves reflected along the way as we develop new language, as we respond to the emergent language, as we create new spaces, for there to be a collective keeper and a collective engagement that can lead to the freedom and dreams that we were articulating earlier on in this conversation.
Yeah. I could add a little bit.
Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Please. No, go ahead, please.
Just to sort of in that vein, Monique, I think, sort of thinking about the flaw in the question. And so, thinking about the solution to the flaw in the question for me sort of demands that we really start to shift our philanthropic lens to ask the question, what does it mean to care for the most vulnerable in any circumstance? And the category of most vulnerable is not necessarily a static designation. It really does change it changes based upon your vantage point and how you ask the question. For example, I've heard it said so many times that Black men and boys are the most impacted by violence, and they do it in this really Trumpian way where they just say it so much that it becomes true. But for me, that's crazy as hell. It doesn't actually think about what is the full sort of spectrum of violence that one can face, and how does that change based on gender? So sure, if you're talking about Black boys in Chicago, absolutely, they may be most impacted by, say, gang violence. But if you're talking about sexual violence, it's staggering the levels of violence that girls of color, that Black girls specifically face. I've seen studies that said it's 60%, and I have my sort of doubts that isn't really underreported. If you then sort of change and interrogate that question a little further, add a few variables to that model. Say, for instance, in rural South Dakota, as a colleague pointed out to me once, if you're asking who is experiencing the most violence, it's not Black men at all. It's women and Indigenous women. So it really does matter how we ask the question, because that really does offer us a blueprint for how we're going to do everything else after that. And so I think that we need to be able to be nimble and continually ask, no matter what issue is presented, who's the most vulnerable here? And how, by helping the most vulnerable, and in any instance, are we actually helping our entire community, right? And advocating for the most vulnerable doesn't denigrate the other people in the conversation. It's saying we all deserve to live full, happy and healthy lives. All of our flowers need to get water. I think what I'd be arguing for is a philanthropy that really, is trust-based, that's values forward, that responds to our structural inequities, ones that it has an anti-racist and sort of gender justice focus, and it includes an awareness of our intersections, and it holds the most vulnerable at the center.
Yeah, I want to add to what Shonda says, because and build on something I heard Monique say as well, because I think that it's part of it is a language problem, and language problems create perception and reality problems. Because the minute we say the most of anything or the least of anything, it somehow privileges just that set of people. If we were to say our community is vulnerable, that our systems of being in family are vulnerable, and that we ought to be serving all vulnerable people, all vulnerable Black people. Because the minute we say who's the most, almost implicitly, it turns into the oppression Olympics. Who's the most deserving? Well, we're all deserving. All of our children. I think about this in an equity way. I got 5 kids. I love them equally, and I like them equitably. And by that, I mean, equity means giving unequal need to unequal resource to unequal need. So each of them was different and is different and needed something different. I love all of them a lot. Would lay down my life for my children, right? But some days I do not like them. I do not like their behavior. I do not like how they talk to me sometimes. And I had to keep reminding myself that I love you all equally. And then I had children say, well, you gave my sister this and that. I said, but you're not your sister. What she needed, the talk she needed in high school about safety was different than the talk you got, for good reason. Because she was more at risk of being sexually assaulted than he was. But that doesn't mean that he was not vulnerable. So my point is that if we start thinking about our children, boys, girls, however they identify across that gender continuum, we think about approaches to that, targeted universalism, giving everybody what they need, but in the way they need it. And that's just hard for philanthropy, because we do this cookie cutter thing where we think that this grant, this RFP is going to meet the needs of this particular set of young people no matter what, right? So that the last couple of things I say, Mike, what could we have done differently? I think we could have done our optics way differently. Like when President Obama got up and gave that great press conference, wouldn't it have been amazing if Michelle had been standing next to him announcing my sister's keeper? Like if both optics had been in place, even though the Commission on Women was in place already, but the optics mattered too. And it's not just about the Obamas. I think they did as much as they could do under the circumstances politically that they had. And that's a whole nother conversation. The last thing I want to say is this, and it's going to sound a little bit over the top, but on behalf of the people in the field, the men and women in the field who were in the field for the last 20 years, we might not have had the intent might have been good, but the impact that Monique and Shonda and Shai are talking about happened. So I apologize on behalf of the rest of us for not getting this right, for not doing it the way that we know we need to do it. That we need to have enough conversations to express, like, whether it was intentional, whether it was out of, lack of knowledge, information, or wisdom, that was never the intention to leave the girl on the end of the field that I've been part of. But because the impact was not consistent with the intent, I'm apologizing on behalf of the brothers and the sisters, because there were sisters at those tables too, who constructed something that caused hurt and pain to my other family members. Period. Hard stop.
Yeah, and that's great. And we're gonna shift the conversation and talk about solutions. But I'll ask a question from the audience that connects to this. So the question is, beyond this conversation, what else needs to be done in the immediate to heal the relationship and connections between Black men and boys and Black women and girls around this work? And what can we do now just for reconciliation? So I think the acknowledgement thing is key, and thank you for saying that, Greg. But are there other things that we should be doing to move the work forward in terms of being better aligned, both optically and relationally together?
Yeah, I have ideas about that. I mean, I think it's important to have the gender responsive work. I've written this, it's been published in multiple spaces, that I always felt like the investment that is gender responsive is important, deep kind of work. And we need to ensure that we're not constructing modalities that we are calling healing modalities that exacerbate the harm because we are so rigid in our understanding of what it means to be gender responsive. And we're so rigid with our priorities that we don't trust the evolving language, movement, and organizing work in community. That's why for me, for this work to truly be intersectional, we have to really do this in a participatory way. We have to bring in those who are impacted, so our community of folks, and say, what is it that we're trying to build together? That so much of how, what I've been observing about philanthropy, and now, I'm a part of it, is, that there are these constructs that are developed on one end, and then it's presented to the community, as opposed to there really being an opportunity for those who we seek to resource, really being a part of developing what it is that we're constructing in ways that, provide maximum opportunity for collaboration, for true partnership, not just we'll co-sponsor some events and show up together, but to really think about what it means to cultivate language that is responsive to all of what it is that we're trying to create and who we're trying to speak to and for in some instances. And to really consider then what that means in terms of some of the modalities and resources that we're trying to move into community. Like, I'm with Shai on the sense that we're trying to move these coins into the community to do this repair work, right? What does that mean if we're doing it in a way that sometimes speaks to people where they identify along their gender identity, right? And how does that intersect with some of the other things that we're seeking, if those other, sort of pieces of identities are met with some form of oppression? And how do we then maintain a flexibility among ourselves to be able to resource movement work in a way that's meaningful? To me, all of the answers to that resonate with this notion of participatory engagement. And where young people push back and say, we'll go to grant makers for, I'll talk about myself. We'll go to grant makers for girls of color because I see a portion of myself in that work, but I'm also clear that I identify as she, they, and I'm expansive in some of this space. Are you going to see me, right? Are you going to respond to me? Are you going to include me in your programming and strategies and grant making, efforts that, are responsive to what I need today? And these are real questions that we grapple with. And, my response is, yeah, so let's create a system that makes sure that we're doing just that, right? And being that flexible with our capacity. Or really, I would probably frame that differently and say, be that capacious in our articulation of what it means to be gender responsive, that we are able to build these meaningful partnerships in real time.
And Shai, I wanted to ask you a question connected to that, because one of the questions we got from the audience was this idea of how do we each get a pie? Why are we sharing one pie, right? How do we grow the amount of resources? And I think, Shai, as you think about your work in terms of reparations and the way that you really think expansively about what that means, how do we do something like that? Something that a lot of the conversation of reparations, it's like, it's about generational wealth. It's not really about gender. But how do we do something like that in a way that's gender responsive and gender forward in terms of where we're thinking about it?
Yeah, I really want to affirm everything that Monique said about being participatory, right? At Cypress, we're 100% participatory, from the name to the colors to our grant making strategies to our values around who we accept money from. It's people who live in the community that are a part of this process with us, that make decisions, that help us co-write grants, that help us write thank you notes, that tell us like, hey, actually, no, that's not money I want anything to do with. Or like, hey, this is actually the healing process that I need to be able to go into relationship with that person. And simultaneously with the donors who are engaging with us, they're coming to our space and saying, hey, actually, I want to be in right relationship with this person. I recognize that my healing is directly connected and I need to expand. I need to grow bigger. I need to give more. And I want to give more outside of just my money. I want to show up for that person. I want to be there to help them write a resume. I want to be in their community. I want to see what this looks like, right? So I think it's this two-parted thing. One part where we're talking about what does it actually look like to be participatory, to share power, to shift systems, and to shift people's hearts. At the core, all of philanthropy is some wealthy person somewhere grabbed up too much money, made some decisions about how they thought things should go, and a bunch of people now have to execute that plan, right? That's all of us are just executing the plan of someone who may or may not currently be living, right? But if we are able to shift the mindsets, the hearts of those folks, if we are actually talking about building power, if we're actually talking about being participatory, that's how we get a bigger pie. And that's actually my work, right? That's not movement's work. So it's not movement's job to help donors understand why they should be better. That's not your work. That's my work, right? My work is to help them do that. And that's also their work. So movement's work is to build, dream, and think differently. My job is to help donors be able to come to a place where they can be expansive. And our donors' work, right, is to move to a place where they recognize I have hoarded a ton of wealth. I am a wealth hoarder and I need to let this thing go. And I need to let it go in a way that allows me to heal, in a way that allows me to transform, in a way that allows me to impact my children's children's children. That is how we build a bigger pie. That's how we build so many pies. There's an abundance of pies. We out here eating cookies now because we done had so much pie we don't want no more. We're talking about something else. We're building a new economy. We're moving outside of a space of capitalism. We're moving to a new place of existence that doesn't have language yet because we have not been there. We are science fiction writers. And that is the work. And even bigger than that, as my grandma would say, we are children sleeping on the black pews. You know, in the back of a Baptist church, you know, you see all the kids just piled up one on top of each other, getting collective rest. That's what we're actually doing, right? We're removing, you're a kid, you don't care. That person got on a red dress, you ain't never seen that person before. But on the back of that pew, all of y'all are sleeping, all of y'all are getting rest, all of y'all are getting nourished, all of y'all are safe. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're building so much pies, everybody can't have none. We're getting collective rest together. We're removing some of those things, and we're talking about what it means to be an actual community.
So I've really enjoyed the conversation in terms of articulating like this really bold vision for what the future looks like. And we've been throwing around terms like gender responsive and talk about folks that are on a gender spectrum and non-binary. And whenever I think that's the language that we have to describe the lived reality of folks in the field and how we have to serve and build towards them. But I think about just the challenge of doing this work across generations and connecting with folks that didn't grow up in a world where there was the possibilities that we're talking about. And so I'm just wondering about if folks have thoughts. One of the questions from the audience was, can we talk more about the point around intergenerational relationships in this fight for Black liberation? And so we talk about some of how we in a relationship with each other in terms of as movements, but how can we be in relationship with each other as generations of folks in this Black community?
I'll offer a little bit something on this. One of the experiences that we've been having with the Brotherhood Elders Network here is that we're 3 generations, now soon to be 4, in the room. And this is men, and there's a parallel group of women who are organizing themselves in a similar way. And I think that the thing that we've got to continue to remind ourselves of is that, just like when Shai uses the metaphor of the pies, like I probably would substitute cobbler, peach cobbler or something. I'm cobbler guy, and to use that metaphor though is like, we got older folks in our community who have been making and consuming cookies, pies, cobbler, German chocolate cake a long time. They've been in the movement. They've been in the Black Panther Party, Republic of New Africa, SCLC, NAACP. Every generation that comes, BLM, Movement for Black Lives, Occupy, all those movements are built on some sense of what happened before. But I think a lot of times is like we start forgetting our youthfulness. And I was like this. It was as if I invented the movement, because Marion Edelman and Angela and all those, the older heads, they didn't get it as right as they could have. So I think part of it becomes allowing the elders in the room to say what they need to say, but not dictate the conversation. You get a middle generation of folks who are now engaged in the way everybody on this panel is. You're running something, you're leading something, you're able to actually move resources. So why not tap into the wisdom of those elders? Because sometimes elders tell you stuff that is throwaway, some stuff you really need. As John Henry Clark used to say, it's like we should look at our history, take what's good, and throw the rest in the garbage can of history. Leave behind female genital cutting. Leave behind, like, we're going to put hands on people every time they say the wrong thing, right? Then reach over to the younger folks and who have the innovation, who have the lived experience, who are going to be dealing with all of the sets of crises that we're currently dealing with. And I think that if we give them the resources, the leadership opportunities, get out of the way, because the only way people can lead is by leading. Like you have to create the facilitate the circumstances for people to actually lead. So I think the intergenerational piece, I go back to this notion of we think like Europeans. We think like white people. We think that older people are supposed to be put over here to the side and they just supposed to sit. That's not how communities work. Generally, in the communities that we come from in the South, communities in up and down the coast of West Africa, wherever, older people are taking care of the babies. Why? Because it's the older people who have a certain sense of calm and they're not running around. So if you extend this to movement work and think about everybody's role, what is the proper role for elders in BLM? What's the proper role for cisgendered men in BLM that's mostly led by queer women? If we could interrogate that a bit and figure out what's our highest and best purpose to each other, as village, as family, whatever metaphor we want to use, I'm still thinking double dutch. I'm still thinking, because if everybody has some version of double dutch, now you may have to slow the rope down a little bit, for me, now maybe Monique being there doing the triple time, But all these metaphors, all these ideas about our culture and rhythm and music and how we move in the world and how we see things and how we see nature, we got to take all of that into effect right now. We cannot think about this singular narrow lane of what's professional and what does philanthropy need. We need to blow it all up. And we need to blow it up in a responsible way, reassemble those pieces. Take Michael's door metaphor and put the doors to the side, put them in storage, because we're going to need some doors and windows. But build that foundation and then bring these other pieces and put it on in a way that's got some elegant design to it that can serve the next generation.
I mean, I hear the invitation to activate our radical imagination in philanthropy. Like, Greg, one of my favorite things that you have offered in community is when you say that our ancestors ate hoghead cheese and chitlins so that we could be vegetarians, right? Like, at some point, we have to say thank you to the things that got us to this space. And now that we have other tools that we know can actually nourish our bodies and, you know, facilitate healing, you know, we can engage that work. So I know I accept the invitation, and I'm hopeful that we can, you know, engage together.
The only thing I would add to this conversation is we also have to be mindful that I had a former boss say to me recently, "You're not as young as you used to be," because I still see myself as young. But as I have more people in their early 20s coming in to work on my team, I recognize I am not as young as I used to be. And we all have to be mindful and realize when we no longer represent the young people that are coming up or on the streets. And so I feel like if my team, if my board doesn't represent the communities that we're serving, and we do not have a diversity of opinion and of ages, of races, of gender, then we're getting it wrong. We're not going to build the solutions that are needed for the communities that we're serving. And I think many of us forget that Moses Joshua pass that is supposed to happen, and we get really comfortable in our seat, and we still think we always know the things that we knew when we were right in the middle of it. And for those of us that are sitting in those seats, we have to be very mindful of it, because the gray hairs and the thinning hairs and it happens much more quickly than I think any of us are willing to admit.
All right. I'll just add one quick thing, and that is I would like to just really encourage us to start from the center and to continually be doing our own political education, like to stay curious and to stay learning. I very often, you know, get to learn not just from young people. I get to learn from my colleagues. I get to learn from people I don't agree with. A colleague told me the other day, and mind you, you know, I consider myself, you know, relatively woke, but you know, we were talking about, you know, the work, and we were talking about the idea of help, and I was like, yeah, well, we want to help, and she said, wait, let me stop you right there with that help, because that help might be colonizing, right? And I was like, colonizing. You know who I am. Black, I'm colonizing. But, you know, it's absolutely true. It could be, right? And so I think we have to stay in places that are uncomfortable, and we have to surround ourselves with people who are going to challenge us, you know, again and again and again. And I think that, you know, when we say philanthropy, sometimes it's like this sort of them, right? We're talking about the white folks of philanthropy. We're not talking about us, right? And I mean, you know, us, you know, beloved community that exists both outside and inside. You know, it's like, what work do we have to stay doing, you know, so for ourselves and for each other. And so I really encourage us to stay proximate to ideas that we agree with and ones that we don't, to stay curious, to stay learning, to stay centering joy, because I feel like part of what made this conversation so fantastic and amazing is that we started it in joy, right? I think that, yeah, I want to just continue to advocate for a philanthropy that complicates questions and assumptions and that disrupts again and again and again.
Connected to that, we've got about a little over 5 minutes left. And so wanted to hear from folks. I mean, I think about the folks that are on there. I was chatting with people before we got in here in the lounge while the DJ was going. And I just think about these amazing leaders that are listening in right now who like you all, are holding power and resources and authority. What are the things that we need for folks that are leading like you all in the field to be doing to chart a different path forward for this work?
Well, Michael told me on our prep call that you got to stop putting sugar in grits, and I say that's not true. Don't put me in your box.
Butter and salt, maybe a little cheese. That's all I'm saying.
This is a generational point, like, because at a certain age, you just know you don't put sugar on grits. I'm sorry, you don't. It's like, you can put some shrimp in the grits, you can put some cheddar cheese in the grits, but you can't be putting those. Anyway, I would say, back to your question, but that's probably a metaphor for something too, you know, because actually it should be okay. I can't believe I'm saying this. It should be okay to put sugar in grits, because if that's how you like it, and it gets your day going, then it's cool. That's kind of what philanthropy needs to do. We need to give it to people the way they need to get it, right? And general support over multiple years, and start doing more participatory grant making, spend downs. Stop hoarding I love what Chai said. Stop hoarding the wealth. Stop having the money sitting around. If you got an endowment of $1 billion, if nothing else, the IRS, the tax code requires you to spend a minimum of 5%. It doesn't say a maximum of 5%, but most philanthropic boards act like that's the law. That's the rule. You have to only spend 5%. Well, no. How about in a time like now, spend, 10% of your corpus, right? And the last thing is, involve the community that you say you serve in the decision making, in the evaluation do more participatory evaluation processes where we kind of say back to funders, here's what works about the way you've supported us. Here's what we could have done better.
I'll give you three quick things that I think to move the needle. One, the treetops need to follow the grassroots. The organizations that My Brother's Keeper Alliance invest in on the ground are creating applications in order to apply for funding from us that says it's about boys and young men of color. If you look at Black Family Development Inc. in Detroit, you look at RISE in Richmond, California, you look at Omaha Empowerment Network, they are serving the community. They recognize that you can't build up a boy without building his mother, his father, his grandmother, his neighborhood. And so we are the ones, oftentimes in philanthropy, to what Shonda was saying, in these positions of power that are doing the division that just doesn't exist on the ground. And so we need to make sure that we're learning from what's happening on the ground, and we would see all sorts of change. The other thing I think we need to do is start telling the truth. I think there's a misconception out there, like, for the gender-based programs, neither side is doing well. There was no major windfall that set up the Boys and Young Men of Color field for the next 50 years. The Boys and Young Men of Color field is struggling, still going hand to mouth to philanthropy, to the same people trying to survive and support some of this gender-based work. There was no windfall. There was lots of announcements that were made, but that the boys and men of color space still has a whole lot of work to do to be strong, both on the ground and at the national level. And the third thing I would want to say is we all have to do a better job of building relationships. This is the longest conversation I've had with Shonda, with Shai, with Dr. Morris. I've talked to Greg and Michael all the time. That's on me. I need to do better. But if we're going to change the game, we have to build relationships. And some of that isn't even because, I don't want to talk to them. Some of us, we get so busy into our day-to-day life that we forget about building those relationships that will lead to true liberation and lasting change for our communities.
Awesome. We've just got time for one more. If somebody else wants to jump in.
I'll jump in here. I think the things that I would say is be yourself, right? In all the spaces. I am the same person if you meet me at Spelman's Homecoming, if you see me at my grandma's house around the corner, if you catch me in the grocery store, like I am the same person in every single space. And that allows people to be themselves completely, to release, to, remove the veil, to remove the power and to talk like people, right? The other thing is to get your rest. The movement gonna be here when you wake up, and it's gonna be here when you go to sleep. But if you don't lay down and take care of your body, if you don't rest, if you don't take time for yourself and make sure that you're okay, we're going to lose you before we lose the movement, before we lose the struggle. And then I think the last thing is give up them coins. Now, and I mean this from every sense, right? So I remember I had a conversation with Monique, and it was our first professional conversation. And I was like, I've been going to Grant Makers to Girls Colors conferences for so long. I'm going to move a grant to y'all, and I'm also going to become a monthly donor, right? Like, how do I, both in my work, move money and move the coins to the things that I care about, but then within my own account, right? Like, how do I invest in work that's important to me? How do I invest in communities that I feel affirming with my grantees? If your work is bomb, I am a monthly donor. I am in there sustaining you, even if it's $5, $10, $20, because in the end, those dollars add up. Support the work, get your rest, be yourself.
I just want to thank all of you all because for folks listening, this is how you have this conversation, right? You start with the vulnerability of acknowledging who we are as human beings, talking about the hurt that we've experienced as a result of some history and some trauma that some of us were a part of, but none of us created. And then you get to acknowledgement of some of the challenge, and then you get to solutions. And so I thank y'all so much for being with us on this journey, being willing to be honest and vulnerable about things that we haven't all got exactly right. And most importantly, being willing to share this time with us. So thank y'all so much. Really enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to continuing it. While we're in the lounge, listening to DJ, we can continue in the chat and continue the conversation with our colleagues.
Cool.
Thank y'all.
No, thank you. Good job, Mike.
Thank you.